to find my Zoom link again, and here we are. Sounds good. Hey, thank you, Michael, and welcome back, everybody. And if you're new, welcome to this fun, action-packed session on learning through diversity. I was telling Michael that, in a span of 59 more minutes, what we hope to do today is to impress upon you the the significance and the value of learning through diversity, why it matters, and how we could bring it into our everyday practices as professors. And this, one of the things I want you to tuck away in the back of your mind, by the way, is that it's not exclusively in the classroom. That's one of the primary objectives and targets that we want to hit, which is how do we embed practices and pedagogies into the learning environments and experiences of our students. But more fundamentally, it's really about developing new habits and new practices that go a long way to creating inclusive relationships for a diverse array of students. And one of the things that we may choose to talk about later on in this series is mentoring and mentoring across differences, because one of the responsibilities that almost everybody takes on in some way, shape, or form, whether you are a faculty member or working in industry or consulting or whatever, is that other people, sooner or later, you become somebody who has a little bit more wisdom, a little bit more knowledge, a little bit more experience than other people, and you begin to serve in a mentoring capacity. And there are some really useful strategies that our center is designed to help people, regardless of discipline, regardless of employment status, to figure out and to develop the strategies for communicating effectively across differences. So if that's something you really want to know more about, I could also pump resources your way. So with that note, on that note, excuse me, what I would like to do is to screen share a little bit so you can see where we left off last time and how this all kind of begins to scaffold together. So if I go down here, where captions more share, there we go. All right, this should do it. And let me see right here. All right. Looks like you see this slide right here that says bringing LTD into the classroom, correct? Somebody give me a thumbs up. All right, cool in the gang. Remember, LTD is just not limited edition like it is for cars. LTD is the shorthand for learning through diversity. So we talk about TAR for teaching as research, LTD for learning through diversity. Where we left off last time was probably with a slide that looked a lot like this, which was about making a connection between teaching as research and learning through diversity. There was a time when we were doing these things as parallel tracks, where students would learn about teaching as research and they would learn about learning through diversity. And then we would talk about how in an ideal world, we would cross the streams, regardless of what they said in Ghostbusters. But if you've seen Ghostbusters, you know that when it's necessary to cross the streams, it works really well. So one of the things that Michael and I talked about last year was, let's just bring them together and develop this whole unified approach to doing teaching as research and learning through diversity as two sides of the same coin. And I'm really fond of this idea because it keeps us from separating out different things and losing the touch points. Because one of the things that we found both with students at our university and in the CIRTL network is that though a lot of the questions that they were asking had far-reaching implications for how to address learning for and among diverse populations. And so we thought, okay, this is great to bring us together. So we make this connection, all right? And we think about bringing it into the classroom. What we really want to do today is to develop the framework for inclusive teaching strategies. And now, because there is no magic, it's not like by the end of this hour you'll say, I know it all, I can do it all. What we can do, hopefully, is to, I'm going to put this into the screen presentation mode, is to develop some strategies that strike us as interesting and we want to know and learn a little bit more about, knowing that there's going to be depth on each one of these, right? Because sometimes it's easy to say something like, oh, try different ways of doing a thing. But then you think, oh, yeah, that sounds great. But what kinds of different things? How do I know what to try? What are some of the challenges? So the premise for what we're talking about today is that inclusive teaching practices result in inclusive learning experiences. Okay? And by the way, if I were to make a modification to this slide, and in fact, I'm going to do that in real time. I'm going to get out a screen share, and we're just going to make a change here because I want to put the word accessible in here. That it's accessible and inclusive teaching practices result in accessible and inclusive learning experiences. And this is important. I want to include the word accessible in here for a number of reasons. One is that sometimes it provides a safe harbor. If you find yourself working in a state that has laws that seem sometimes very harsh to diversity, equity, inclusion, all those words, believe it or not, sometimes beginning your sentence and your statement with the word accessible takes the tension down a little bit because it's an area where people don't have their heels dug in as much. So what happens is if you begin talking about accessibility, so there is a strategic consideration here, obviously. If you begin a conversation by talking about accessibility, almost nobody is going to look you in the eye and say, I am so tired of these curb cuts. I am so tired of these door handles. I am so tired of these handicap accessible ramps. Get rid of them. No. But when you talk about how we would never close the door to learning experiences to somebody who can't walk, or that we would never close the door to learning experiences for somebody who can't see or can't hear, you then have the opportunity to say, what this really means is when we create accessible learning experiences and learning environments, what we're doing is thinking about the diversity of our students. And when we see the diversity of our students in many different ways, we can then find strategies to address it, right? And it's not like a silver bullet, but it does kind of work. Secondly, accessibility is both a moral and ethical imperative and also a legal requirement. In fact, today I was in an exchange with two vice provosts and a dean about some of the new legal challenges, not legal challenges, legal requirements for content accessibility in web-enabled learning, which means online classes, for example. And a lot of this isn't new, but there are updates and revisions to laws. And in your life, in higher education, you have already been on the receiving end of policies. You will also find that there's going to be more policies and laws affecting the world that you live in. So if we begin designing and developing content that's accessible, we're by definition making it inclusive for all students. So if, in other words, if we think about the size of the font, if we think about the style of the font, if we think about the color schematics or whatever those things are that relate to the content, if it makes learning and attainment easier for somebody with a specifically diagnosed need, by default, it makes it easier and better for those who don't have that need, right? So one of the great things about inclusive and accessible learning is that all the things that we do sometimes to create opportunities for uniquely defined populations tracks backwards to better learning experiences for all. So when we talk about this premise of accessible and inclusive teaching practices resulting in accessible and inclusive learning experiences, faculty and students bring an array of experiences, backgrounds, and skills to the teaching and learning process. Please, 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 pretty please, in fact, don't think about your class so much as I have so little time and so much content. How am I possibly going to pull this off? I mean, we all kind of wrestle with that, but one of the things that we know from research is that, and Linda Nilsson has written about this. She wrote this book called Online Learning at Its Best. One of the points she makes is that dense content is a barrier to student learning. We always like to think that you just more, more, and more. And living in Idaho, I use the example or the analogy of an overstuffed baked potato, which I'm starving, so this sounds fantastic to me right now. But there's a point at which, you're like, you know what? I mean, I feel badly because Amy's exercising as we speak. Yeah, I want to load it up, man. I want butter in it at least, And if there's some sour cream, why not? If I got a slab of bacon, I'm throwing in some bacon, but I'm probably not going to throw a cheeseburger in there. So there's a point at which enough is enough. So don't fall in love with the dense content. Do realize that when you make a connection with your students, one of the things that is statistically proven to result in not just the positive learning experience, but even the retention of a student who might otherwise drop out is the bond that they build with you. So don't ever, I mean, imposter syndrome might hit you. Different things might affect you that make you think, oh, man, I'm just the guy who teaches. They're the students, I'm the teacher. Don't look at it that way. You're somebody whose background and experiences matter. And when you begin to share some of those details about your own lives with your students, that helps your students open up and share some things about themselves. This gets at this notion of identity and belonging. So when we talk about promoting equitable learning experiences and furthering diversity, equity, and inclusion in teaching and learning, a lot of it begins with students' identity and a sense of belonging. I mean, yes, a lot of the research talks about their sense of belonging in a college and a university writ large, but they don't think about it always in those terms, and neither do we. We think about it in terms of our classroom. And so if we could create an environment where students feel some agency, some place, some value, where their background matters, that's going to help a ton. And when you exercise the humility of sharing a little bit about yourself, that's fantastic. I mean, the number of faculty on this campus who have chickens, by the way, is outrageous. I am one of them. I've got chickens. I've got a bunch of chickens, got a bunch of dogs, bunch of cats, bunch of horses. I mean, basically, I live on green acres or something. But when you even little things. So I think about this one professor, a sociology professor, who's got a picture of himself, and I don't know if he still uses it in his Canvas space, but it's a picture of him, with an ascot, literally with an ascot around his neck. He's wearing a tweed coat. He's got a pipe in one hand and a chicken in another, and he's looking very formal, and it's hilarious. And the students, then you laugh, and it takes the tension down a little bit. So when you start including those little things about who you are and what you do, don't just ask your students to do that. Don't ask anything of your students that you wouldn't share of yourself. And the more we do this, the more we realize that we're building a bond, we're building a safe space. And this notion, this practice then leads to effective teaching that builds upon those rich resources. And this becomes the foundation of what we call learning through diversity. And on a sidebar, there's a scholar, a friend of mine, who does research on this construct of learning through diversity, and she's at the University of Cork in Ireland, and she's Italian. So she's Italian, working at an Irish institution, and deeply involved in American higher education. And her construct for learning through diversity is a little bit different. She's like through, that's like a wall. You want to break through it? Do we want to break through diversity? I'm like, no, it's not what it's about. What learning through diversity is that just like we learn through an experience, or we learn through reading, or we get fit through exercising. It's operationalizing through in that way. So even though we open up with our students, we have to acknowledge that existing social and educational practices do not always promote equal success for all learners. And you know this as a fundamental truth, I think, of higher education, right? That the best we could do is provide the equality of opportunity for students to succeed, but we can't provide the equality of the outcome. In other words, 25 students might take a test. 22 of them might get an A, right? Now, that doesn't mean that the other ones aren't as smart. They just didn't perform as well in a particular exam by the standards established for that exam. But you can't guarantee the outcome. So we try to create the conditions necessary for successful learning to take place. So this requires intentional and deliberate effort. Those two words come up again and again and again when we talk about learning through diversity. The fact that it takes intentional and deliberate effort on the part of present and future faculty alike. In other words, it doesn't happen by accident, which is something I will come up onto in a little bit. So what we try to do is in this series to frame this. And that's the link to the CIRTL site. Every once in a while, I like to use graphics because they're helpful, right? So sometimes when we think about diversity, I really like the puzzle pieces up on the top, by the way. Because when we think about diversity, if we have a puzzle that's not yet assembled, we see all the unique individual pieces, right? That's like diversity, right? We have this diverse array of pieces where every single one of them, although they're similar to the other in some way, shape, or form, they are in fact truly unique. The relationship between diversity and inclusion is represented in the upper right quadrant, where diversity shows the separate pieces as separate pieces. Inclusion is a reflection of the effort that we make to unify diverse populations and include everyone at the table, right? Include everyone in a learning experience, or to create the conditions necessary for that. Like there might be a piece, like this one over here might be like, yeah, I don't know. I'm jumping out of this. But we've at least got to do everything that we can to be able to create that inclusive environment. And when we talk about inclusion, there's a million different versions of something just like this here at the bottom, which is the diversity that we see in terms of languages. How many of you speak a foreign language? Just show of hands. You can hold up your hand on your screen or just by raising your hand. Okay. Seeing a few hands go up. All right. Now, that's a great thing. It's a great strength. But sometimes if you are a new English speaker in an American higher education system, language can be a barrier, right? So one of the things that we need to be mindful of when we communicate is that we're using a vocabulary that is not alienating. One of the things that happens when we think about education across linguistic barriers is idiomatic expressions. If anybody here speaks another language as a first language, have you ever had experiences with an idiomatic expression or a colloquialism that threw you off? All right, I see you kind of nodding. Did you want to share on that?
Um,
Go
for
ahead.
me, sorry. No, for me, it's when people say what not, and like they're talking to you, and all of a sudden they just throw these words to you, and I was like, what do you mean by that? Like
Mhm.
they think I know it, but I'm like, no, I don't understand what that I was supposed to know what they were saying with that
Uh-huh.
little word. And it just, I mean, I feel like I'm better now since I have been in the country for almost two
Mhm.
decades. But before, it's just like, what am I supposed to know about that? I don't
Yeah.
know.
Yeah, we use figures of speech so often, because and every language and every culture does. But when we learn a language, we tend to learn a language very literally. So, Doris, in the case of speaking Spanish, for example, um, shit and fear sound a lot alike, right? So it's very easy to try to tell somebody that I am afraid, but you're really saying something else, right? That's a linguistic inflection, right? Point. Or um, a bird's beak or a small amount of something, right? Can sound like very similar words. But the difference that really comes out meaningfully in this regard is we're all going to make those mistakes as we learn a language because we do so very literally, where we wonder, like, what is the word for this? What's the word for cup? What's the word for phone? What's the word for pen? So we think about things in a literal way. So when we start using idiomatic expressions, we don't realize how exclusionary that could be when we just use. It's so funny because I'm drawing a blank right now on a good one. Even if it's something simple like that's cool, right? Now, a lot of people that's got some international import, of course, but when we use certain figures of speech, we're not always mindful of the fact that not every, excuse me, not everybody's going to get that point, right? And so we want to make sure that language isn't used in a way that becomes something that, like, that's for us. Well, in America, we always say that. Like, somebody might say, don't have a cow, don't freak out, or whatever that is. And so, like, I don't understand what that means. You have to you have to use language in a way that is welcoming. Understanding, for example, communication across ethnic and religious differences can be very challenging. And I'm not going to say that religion in and of itself is a challenge in a classroom, but sometimes it is, because sometimes we might find ourselves falling back into a default setting of using a figure of speech that might seem to amplify one particular belief system while inadvertently suppressing another. So, thinking about race, culture, skills differentials, right? If we think about the vocabulary that we would use in our discipline for juniors and seniors, that's going to be different than it would be for freshmen coming in. And also, we think about physical abilities, sexual orientation, a broad, diverse array of students. So then the question is, how do we teach inclusively, right? Good question. So, what I want to do is revisit some core concepts here, talk a little bit about a framework, and in a statement of a principle that you'll see at the bottom there. What is an authentic statement of a commitment to DEIA? Almost every, no, can't say that. Many job applications require a diversity statement. They require a student to address what they would do to further equitable learning experiences among diverse students. And some candidates, depending upon the system, the school you apply to, their emphasis will determine what they're looking for. Anything that reeks of inauthenticity will, you'll get dinged on that dimension, but you might be pulled from the pool, right? So if your statement about diversity, equity, and inclusion is weak, they might think that you haven't taken the time to think about ways to reach and teach diverse learners. So one of the things that this series does is it sensitizes us to ways that we can think about that, to then develop practices that you can use as an example. Because when you write your application to a university and they ask you, what have you done to promote inclusion among diverse learners, it's good to have a framing optic, but it's even better if you can follow that up with some concrete examples of things you've done, right? Every once in a while, it's not bad to say something about yourself if there's something that's relevant. A dear friend of mine who runs a disability law firm, had her leg amputated when she was a child. So part of her story is, well, going back to when I was very young, and I realized that all these kids had two legs and I only had one. I had to, find a way to assimilate, to fit in, and to excel and still do the things that everybody did. And that turned into her compassion for and commitment to um, working with children and then working in a law firm to advocate for people who have suffered limb loss, for example, right? So you can tie those things together. But really, what universities are looking for is an other directed optic. They care about you, they're going to want to get to know you, but what they want to see is how you can help and support other people. So if you look at these shapes around the center one, diversity in teaching and learning, equity in teaching and learning, inclusion, bias, cultural humility, accessibility. All of these things are things that if you just keep this graphic somewhere handy, this is a good thing to come back to always say things like, okay, when we talk about diversity, what does diversity look like in teaching and learning? Okay. When we think about equity, right? Equity is the principle of fairness. Equity is not equality. So if we talk about advancing equitable learning experiences, we're thinking about equity in teaching and learning. And a word that you should jot down somewhere right now by that block for equity is an equity frame. Sometimes it's referred to as an equity frame. Sometimes it's referred to as an equity framework. The point, regardless of whether it's a frame or a framework, is that equity puts the burden on us, not our students, okay? And that's one of the most significant transformations in modern higher education. For years, people said students need to do this, students need to do that, students need to get over the other thing. But what we realized was that we had a lot of systemic barriers that were in place. And so when we flipped the script and said, well, let's stop thinking about what students have to do and ask ourselves, are there things that we could do? Are there things that we should do? And when we realized that we can remove some barriers to student learning, we can remove some barriers to student engagement, then from an equity framework, we're positing that it's our responsibility to try to identify and dismantle the barriers to student engagement. And that that's not a lot of work. It's a moral imperative, right? It's don't hide behind the barrier and say students, they can do it or they can't. Am I right? No. Most research indicates that almost all students can do almost all things. They usually just don't want to put the effort into doing all those things as well as everybody else might be doing it. But we also might be keeping some barriers in place. Inclusion. We always talk about saying, oh, yeah, I'm an inclusive person. Yeah, I try to create a welcoming environment for everybody. But are we really, right? So when we think about inclusion in teaching and learning, this includes even our positionality within a classroom. Where do we stand? When I work with faculty members on peer observations of instruction, sometimes you'll see a professor who comes in and they stand at the instructor station and they don't move from it because that's like their life raft, okay? And that's okay because maybe you need the content on the screen right in front of you. But if I'm here and all my students are over there, but there's a small handful here that I'm making eye contact with, whose body language I could read rapidly, who I could call on and respond to very easily, what we find is that where our eyes go, where our bodies go, where our attention goes, says a lot about how inclusive we are in our practices. So if you ever want to have teaching, like have somebody like me or somebody from my center come in and work with you on this, it's a lot of fun because we talk about things about how we navigate the spaces, and we also gather student input on that. And to be honest with you, a lot of students want to be anonymous. I mean, I would love to say that every student goes in there wanting to have their mind blown every day. Not true. There are students who want to sit as far away and say, can't say I wasn't here, you know? And sometimes they are engaged, just not participating. Bias, we'll talk about bias in just a minute. Um, there are implicit biases that we all have at some level. And I don't say that to shame anybody, but sometimes the implicit biases that we have, they're not explicit. We're not trying to come up with something that mischaracterizes somebody. Sometimes out of a lack of awareness or out of ignorance, we have small little biases, right? So there are ways that we could kind of check and keep our biases in check, because what happens is that bias then leads to what we call operative assumptions, right? And so people will say things like, and we hear this all the time, oh, that's a first generation student. Well, you know, first generation students tend to blah, 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 blah. Well, you're really just leveraging assumptions based upon a bias that you already have. When people think about different categories of students in different ways, they sometimes leverage that those biases as well. But one of the really cool things is that when you start thinking about accessibility and inclusivity in teaching and learning, um, we come to this principle of cultural humility inevitably, right? Cultural humility, it's disorienting at first, but kind of beautiful after we accept that we need to sometimes accept that there are things that we don't know, for example, about another culture. And we need to have the learning through diversity element of cultural representation sometimes educate us. So it's about exercising some humility, and it's the precursor to what we call culturally responsive pedagogy, which is finding ways to be more inclusive of the different elements of identities with which we're working, and in accessibility. And we'll talk about one of the problems here with this, not problems, challenges, is that there's this little exercise that I like to do with students. If we were meeting live and in person, I would have you look at this iceberg here and fill in what's on top of the surface and what's below the surface. Does anybody have a sense of what this iceberg imagery represents? Have you ever seen anything like this before? All right. Well, if you haven't, um, when we think about the tip of the iceberg, you know that figure of speech, right? We'll talk about metaphors and colloquialism. Oh, I just noticed things. Okay. All right. Um, that what do we mean when we talk about the tip of the iceberg?
Would it be like what you see about a person and what's visible because the rest of the iceberg is underwater, so you don't know what is behind someone's physical features or what they're going through?
Exactly, right? That the tip of the iceberg are those things that are readily apparent. And, you know, we could think about, well, the Titanic. I mean, maybe they should have said, oh, look, an iceberg. And icebergs don't, they might not look big, but one of the things that we know about those bergs of ice is that there's always more under the surface than there is above the surface, right? So the idea of the tip of the iceberg is that if we were cruising through the water, we would think that we're navigating our way through this complicated environment effortlessly and easily because we're not hitting these icebergs. There's one, there's one, there's one. But what we're not seeing is all the stuff that lies beneath. So if we talked about some of the things that would be up here, like on the top of the iceberg, the tip of the iceberg, what would you find here? What's an element of diversity that you could say, oh, that's an easy one. That's the tip of the iceberg. Doris?
Language, language.
Okay, language, right? Because it's not always what you see, it's what you hear. So you could walk into a room, and let's be honest, if we think about bias for a minute, right? An operative assumption, sometimes we're wrong. But have any of you ever walked into a room and you looked at people and um, you saw students and wondered immediately, if English is their first language? Yeah. If you haven't, you will have experience like that at some point. So it's not just what you see on the tip of the iceberg. It could be what you hear. Language, okay. Anything else? Amy?
Age,
Age?
age,
Okay. Yep. Because yes. So we can say, okay, we can hear language. We could see age. So if we wrote those in there, okay, what else?
Personal style.
Personal style, okay. And what kind of judgments might come with the personal style?
Well, if you walk into a room and you see someone wearing a leather jacket with studs and a mohawk, you might wonder why they're in an MFA class or a bio class or something,
Mhm.
right?
On our campus, I mean, minus the studded leather jacket, our vice president for research has the spiked up mohawk, right? So sometimes, there could be this image of the old like vintage era punk look, and like, oh, but we make assumptions, whether we admit it or not. Assumptions could be there. So there's a sense of style or how somebody looks. Um, and there are a lot of hidden elements to this that when we talked about moving to online during COVID, and a reason why we tried encouraging faculty to not bully their students into turning their cameras on, because some students had a life that they didn't want the rest of their class to see, right? And because there's this thing, a sociological concept of and communication theory called social judgment theory, that people could see inside your home. Like right now, for example, I could see Doris and Amy and Michael's environment. This is my office environment. And we could have some assumptions about these kinds of spaces, right? And of course, everything we're looking at right now looks normal and sane and healthy. But when you have a lot of people living in a one-room house, and we have students that live that way. When we have students who don't, we have homeless students on our campus. We have students that were pulling into a McDonald's parking lot to get the free Wi-Fi because they live 3 towns away, and that was the best they could do, right? There's reasons. So everything that we see, everything that we hear, gives us a sense of the diversity, right? So sometimes it's like, wow, and we don't want to be judgmental and say poverty or wealth or anything like that. But there are things that we see and experience. And then one of the things we find, and I'm not really happy with this particular waterline visibility, but there's some of the stuff that's very accurate, right? Skin color, whether we admit it or not. Like, don't be that person who says, oh, I don't see difference. I don't see race. It's you do, and it's not a bad thing. Some of your students might be white students, some of your students might be black students, some of your students might be male identifying, some might be female identifying. So we could think about the potential fluidity of, or the actual fluidity of gender, but the gender roles, right? So sometimes on the surface, people say things like, oh, tell me about your class. And people typically come back and say something about the tip of the iceberg. Oh, I've got a really diverse class. There's a variety of people of different races, different ethnicities, different cultures, different genders. There's some non-traditional students and some first-year students, right? That's a snapshot of that particular class. And that sometimes makes us excited. It also cues us in and says, we see some things that we need to be very mindful of. We need to make sure that our examples are not alienating. Peeking up above the surface sometimes, we'll just take a couple of these. We'll take, for example, physical ability. Some physical abilities are immediately apparent. If, for example, you have a student who's in a wheelchair, right? You know that their physical ability is different. Their ambulatory ability is different than someone else's in a class. If you have somebody who's para or quadriplegic, right, that their ability to be able to do certain things as a result of that might be different. You will probably have a CETL accommodation notice for a student in that particular position. But the thing is to be mindful of different aspects of, for in this regard, for example, physical ability, because sometimes our classrooms are not really optimally designed to be very accommodating or very inclusive. So there's some things that we see above the surface, but there's some things that exist a little bit below the surface. A lot of us have things going on that nobody knows. I would say all of us have things going on in our life that nobody knows about. And one of the really bizarre things is that sometimes with the physical ability, there's a lot of sympathy and empathy because we see it and we feel for it. But, the running half tongue-in-cheek statement is, you get a lot of sympathy with a broken leg, but you get no sympathy with a broken heart, right? But we know that the emotional damage, scars that we don't see, doesn't mean that something is less impactful, okay? So there might be some things where there's a part of it poking above the surface and a part below the surface. There are some things that are buried a little bit more deeply beneath the surface. Political views. So I'm a political scientist. Boy, it's a hoot teaching political science right now. But sometimes students' political views are very deeply buried. Other times, that's the first thing they want you to know, right? Hi, I'm Larry. I'm a fill in a blank, or I'm whatever the ideology is. So there are certain things there that might be below the surface, but we want to make sure that we don't teach in a way that is alienating. So we can be biased when we teach, right? We don't want to be exclusionary. Like we can and need to have some lines that we that keep us in our lanes, right? Where we can say, no, we're not. That's unacceptable in this particular class. It's uncivil or something like that. But what we really need to make sure is that we're not creating learning experiences for people who share our political views and not for students who oppose our political views. So the strategies, and we'll get into some of these later on, not today, but as we go on with this, there's ways that we could engage meaningful dialogue representing viewpoint differences very constructively and very capably. There's also going to be differences in terms of perspectives. I'm not really fond of the word talents here, but it was just sort of a low-hanging fruit example. So as we progress through this, as a primer, this slide looks a little bit dense, and I'll get you all a copy of it because all these links are live. Some of these come from the Poorvu Center at Yale University, because they were out ahead of some of these things earlier on when they came up with these tests, right? So there's the implicit bias and critical reflection tools that include things like the Yale Center stuff, the Harvard stuff. It's a way you could do these tests to see, do I have implicit bias? If so, what kind, what level? I've always been on a fence with how useful those self-diagnostic tools are. They can be handy because sometimes the examples that they use, you might say, yeah, I get it. But sometimes it's healthy to have an encounter with something which is sort of like common sense. So thinking about these different the different ways of assessing implicit bias that might exist in our own lives and in our own teaching is healthy. But then there's also this link, which is a link to an inventory of inclusive teaching strategies. We've got ours, Harvard's got theirs. It doesn't hurt to have, the more the merrier. But all this builds around these three principles up here. That if we think about three things everybody can do, right? Inclusive teaching strategies can be put into one of these three categories. One is making sure that you incorporate diverse perspectives into your course, okay? So that, number one, incorporate diverse perspectives into the course content by using readings that aren't. So some simple examples are, if everything is always heteronormative, it's going to exhibit a bias towards populations that are heterosexual, right? If the the books that we use and the essays that we assign and the images that we use are always of one particular ethnicity, one particular race, then what that does is it kind of narrows the narrative, right? So if you think about it, if you were to go online and say, I want a picture of a bunch of students holding up their hands, there's so many vector graphics out there for that. And you almost never see a whole bunch of white hands in the air, right? What you'll see is a deliberate attempt by the artist to say, we're going to color and shade these all a little bit differently, right? To represent the diversity that exists. If you use examples of, a classroom or a boardroom and everybody is a white man wearing a suit and tie, that's going to exhibit a bias towards that particular population. Well, there might be proportionally more of that category of person in a particular job. It reinforces part of the reason why there are more of those people in those particular jobs. So we also want to make sure that in our case studies, our PowerPoints, and our lectures, that they offer a variety of different examples, okay? But that we don't tokenize particular individuals, students, or representations. Because one of the challenges that we've got to overcome is, in an attempt to be inclusive, sometimes we tokenize, and we don't want to do that. That can be very hurtful, harmful to a student, right? To always be like the black voice in the class, or the gay voice in the class, or the whatever it is voice in the class. Okay, so be mindful that it doesn't become a tokenizing experience. You can also create an inclusive classroom climate where students are encouraged to participate, right? And this is on us, right? Sometimes we walk into a room and we say, man, they're just not a chatty group, or no matter what I do, I can't get them talking. But the question is, how much effort are we really putting into it, right? How much energy are we investing in a process of getting our students to participate? And not only that, how much effort are we putting into creating an inclusive climate, right? So not just for engagement, not just for particular participation, but to bring inclusion to the forefront, to hear about and learn about backgrounds, and to tailor our teaching approaches in order to be able to establish ground rules for handling controversial issues. It helps if we know our students. So we need to create that inclusive classroom climate where people are free to speak up. And the third thing is incorporating universal design for learning principles. UDL is the acronym for Universal Design for Learning, is a very commonly used framework for ways of thinking about creating accessible and inclusive learning experiences for the greatest number of students imaginable. One simple way to begin to frame UDL is by thinking about engagement, representation, and actions and expression. Okay? Now, a lot of the research on universal design for learning comes from universal design. So it's actually an architectural theoretical foundation that's been applied to higher education, right? So having something universally designed means that it has the greatest number of potential citizens in any environment taken into consideration when designing a fill in a blank. So a good example of this is on campus, right? A universally designed campus will have not doorknobs. Doorknobs would get an F on UDL. Door latches that go up and down, right, would score much higher. Having a button that could be pushed to have a door open up automatically might score even higher still. So if you think about in architecture, how universal design came into play, the curb cuts that were created where, a sidewalk meets a road, it doesn't just drop off, were designed to accommodate, we could say, well, wheelchairs, and then baby carriages. And then, we realize that almost everybody benefits from having something that they're less likely to trip over going down or going up. Okay. As it applies to higher education, universal design is about making that same kind of commitment to lower the entryway and lower the barrier for every student to participate and engage. One of the sessions that we're going to have in here is going to be led by two UDL experts. We're also going to have a session led by indigenous scholars talking about culturally responsive pedagogy. So the really good stuff is on the very near horizon. But right now, just as part of this primer, UDL really is helpful when we think about invisible barriers, right? And an excellent example of this is students who may be on the autism spectrum, okay? There are certain defaults that faculty have hardwired into their brain. One is, I don't care who you are. If you come into my classroom, you take those headphones off. Well, while that might seem like a reasonable thing to say because you want your students to be interested and engaged in a class that you're teaching, the thing that might be missing is that those earphones might serve a particular need for a student on a spectrum. It might create pressure that satisfies a proprioceptive need that somebody who is not on a spectrum or not on a part of the spectrum might not have. But for that student, it's the difference between being able to get through the class or not being able to get through the class. And sometimes we could see certain behaviors. And again, if we've been working, I've been working in autism adjacent teaching and learning experiences for probably the past 12 years of my 31-year career in higher ed. And over the course of time, I can say my optic is pretty good, but it ain't perfect, right? Because there's a lot that we don't see. That in another student's brain, their way of processing information is different, okay? So one of the things we think about when we talk about engagement is offering students options that stimulate enthusiasm for learning, right? So when we think about engaging our students, we need to think about ways of engaging all of our students in a way that triggers some appreciation for the content and a learning experience and a learning environment. On the presentation field, we need to think about ways that we could present information in different ways to support access and understanding. So a good example of this is that I've got some colleagues who will say, the only way that you could learn this material is sitting bolt upright in a hardwood chair. And they say that because that was part of the tradition that applied to them. That's what they did. They sat bolt upright in a hardwood chair and memorized. So they therefore think that because they succeeded at that, and they succeeded at that at such a high level that they even earned a PhD in that field, that that's what you have to do to learn. The reality is there's no real research to back that. There's good research, and of one to back the argument that that worked for that person. But as a transferable approach to teaching and learning, there are different ways that we present information and we process information that allow us to address learning in different ways. So we need to think about presenting information in multimodal forms, right? So for example, when doing a PowerPoint presentation, a UDL principle that I often forget to do is to always describe what is seen on the screen. And some people sometimes say, why are you describing that? Everybody could see it. Well, the reality is that's not necessarily true, right? So we go with a visual, we go with text, we go with video, right? We can include different things in our presentation of material. and then students can latch on to what works best. A little bit of advice, and if you want to learn more about this, you could talk to a guy in our center named Doug. He talks a lot about TILT, which is transparency in learning and teaching. Uh, if you really want to know the super short version of that story, it's that when we try to make bigger questions where we embed a lot of examples and hints, we tend to exclude and alienate learning more than we invite learning. Shorter, clearer questions typically get better answers. Action and expression, different options for students. And now just not to go down a rabbit hole in this yet, because we will go into this when Rula and Jen, as our experts, talk about this, is that there are different ways that students can reveal their knowledge. One weird thing is in my constitution law class, I let them do interpretive dance. You might be saying, what does that have to do with political science? But if somebody's talking about systemic cultural oppression and they could talk about liberation through dance, why not? Right? So, not saying go with dance, but sometimes there are different ways to reveal this. This is something that you can download from, it'll be on this slide, and also through our center. One of the committees that I've been on forever here is the President's Council on Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion. And Aaron Chapman and I came up with this little handy-dandy guide about advancing DEIA and all courses in the curriculum. And it's just a little thing that begins with 1, acknowledging diversity, 2, adopting the equity-minded frame that we talked about, 3, applying inclusive, accessible practices, to 4, advance an inclusive climate in our classes. And this over here is just a slide of the process, right? In your syllabus, the first day of class, every day of class, in your assignments, in your activities, in your learning outcomes, and in your instructional methods. Don't talk the talk about inclusion. Don't talk the talk about accessibility. Walk the walk and ask yourself, what am I doing to promote this? This is too many words and too many colors. This is even more words and even more colors. But I have these in here for 2 reasons. One is that at Deakin University, they did something I just, of a lot of stuff that's in the public domain from other universities, I don't like doing a big grab from other places, but every once in a while they do something that's pretty cool, right? Recognizing, providing, designing, representing, scaffolding, building, assessing, providing feedback, fostering reflection. There might be a slide that, like, we say, oh, we're not going to talk about it much in here. But you might look at that and say, I really like that, right? These are some of the reminders that I need. Or here on this one, where I just circled some of these in particular, taking time to think is always important for teaching and learning. But one of the things that my friends at Penn State did was they broke this down in terms of 3 primary areas: the expectations that we set, methods of communicating and collaborating in class, and then strategies for iterative improvement. So you can see things like ensuring equal access, reviewing cultural reference points, triangulating student knowledge, connect as a person, establish course policies. Your syllabus is a great place to have policies about, respect for difference and respect for other. And also double checking names and considering pronouns. This is important, okay? It's okay to ask your students, is this the name that you go by? Do you have a preferred name? Do you have a preferred nickname? What are your pronouns, right? Even if it doesn't matter to you, realize that it might matter to your students. As a ticket out the door, if we did this as a real exercise, what I would ask you to do is think about something you could do in your class. I want to leave this with you, but I want to come back to this because I want to point out on the slides that I'll be sharing with you. There's 2 pages here of resources that our centers designed and developed and organized. And another is just a variety of guides for one's own growth and development in this area. So all these things will be available to you, right? For the amazing low price of $37 million, or free. We'll just go with free. But one of the things I would like you to think about as we conclude today is think about one or two things that you could do in your classes, okay? And you don't have to do that now because it's kind of a cold call. But when you think about this, and when you step back and think and you reflect on this, think about just one or two things where you could say, I could do better. And sometimes it's like learning a student's name. I've got a colleague in my department who uses name tense, and he does it for himself too. And sometimes he gets teased, and people say, like, Graham, why are you doing it? Everybody knows who you are. He goes, yeah, but if I ask my students to do it, I might as well do it too. And we're all part of one big thing, and it reinforces the name. When you grade, by the way, a tiny little thing that can make all the difference in the world to a student is if you use their name in your feedback. So don't just give grades. Like, honestly, if you're going to be that person who just gives a grade with no feedback, even for the A work, you're not doing a big part of your job, okay? I just got to put that out there. Timely and meaningful feedback are two of the most important things we can provide as a faculty member. When you provide your feedback, if you validate your knowledge of who they are, that makes a student just perk up. It makes them happy. It makes them feel seen. It makes them feel valued. So when I grade, I always, even if I'm using Speed Grader on Canvas, I'll say something like, I really enjoyed reading this essay, Amy. One of the things that you did a really nice job of is whatever. And then, sometimes you'll hear the chatter. It's like, he knows my name. And of course, like, we might forget it, but we'll say, well, of course I do. But it's those little things. It's those little itty bitty things. So even if one of your things is to say, I'm going to focus on knowing my students' names. I'm going to focus on taking some time to talk about why a particular assignment is being done to foster inclusivity and what the value of that is. So whatever those things are, whatever those takeaways are, just start thinking about them. Fair enough? Stopping sharing now. So do you have any questions?